On the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, it's perhaps more important than ever that we take up Pope Francis's call to look beyond our borders. With that in mind, it's a real pleasure to welcome Christine Allen, Director of CAFOD, which is, of course, the official aid agency of the Church in England and Wales. Christine, thank you for joining us, especially at a time when so many of the countries CAFOD works in, from South Sudan to Myanmar to Brazil, are facing such exceptionally challenging circumstances.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Liam, and thank you for having us.
So, in his message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, Pope Francis talks about the profound interconnection of the human family, and he appeals for us to build a future of justice and peace together where no one is left behind. What does that mean in practical terms from CAFOD's perspective?
Well, it's very much who we are. Next year, CAFOD celebrates 60 years of our existence. And throughout that time, we've facilitated and supported the Catholic community in England and Wales to work for that future of justice and of peace. And at the heart of our work, whether it's supporting local communities, churches, and organisations around the world, or working with parishes, schools, and religious here at home, is at the heart that sense of interconnection, our deep sense of us being part of one family in one common home, brothers and sisters all. I mean, that just drives us. And I think Pope Francis, taking those comments that I just said before, brothers and sisters all, our common home, one family, they're such Pope Francis words and phrases. He's deepened hugely our work in hearing the cry of the earth and responding to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So what does it mean? Well, yeah, internationally, we work in partnership with people. We don't dictate to people and communities that we work with what they need, but we listen and support and work alongside. We often talk about our partners overseas as local experts because they're the people who are on the front line, they're delivering, they're supporting communities, and very often in very hard to reach places. So all we can do is stand alongside and be part of them and support them and give them the resourcing that they need. We can't meet all the requests that come to us, but we try to use our resources as wisely as we can. And I do have an example, if I might, Liam, because I think it feels very appropriate, particularly on the day when we are thinking about migrants and refugees. It feels very appropriate. In Lebanon, for example, we've supported a national NGO organisation, and it's partly managed by Syrian refugees themselves. And it's piloting new approaches to food production in urban parts of the country. It uses this very innovative approach, and they call it vertical farming. And the objective is to support the individuals in both the Lebanese host community and, of course, in the Syrian refugee community. It helps them establish micro gardens and provides them with quality seeds and other technical insight. And then they're connected to retail chains so that what they produce, they can sell and they can meet their household needs and have a bit of an income. And the important thing about this is it's not just about what the Syrian refugees need, but it helps bring the refugees and the Lebanese communities together. And you can imagine, especially in Lebanon, I mean, something like 25% of the Lebanon population is now refugees. And it's become ever more important given the pressures that Lebanon's been going through recently and the political and economic collapse effectively in the country. And there's a real danger of tension as we see in our own country too. So trying to kind of find ways to bring people together to sustainably kind of provide solutions and to help bring about those connections between communities is so critical for us. And there's countless other examples, but I'll stop there and see if you want to talk about anything particular.
That's such a wonderful practical example. And I think that point about working with people and with host communities and others and CAFOD and agencies all working together rather than, as you say, dictating or working to, really does reflect that human family that the Pope's talked about.
And I love the fact that in his letter, the Pope uses that phrase, we're all in the same boat, because it's all too easy to think somehow we're different, and actually we're not. It's the one of the real joys of being part of the Catholic Church, that kind of the multinational corporation that is the global family that is the Catholic Church. It is seeing our similarities and our connections with people. When I've traveled around, or more recently when I've been on WhatsApp and Zoom calls with people and communities around the world, it always strikes me that we all have the same dreams, we all have the same desires, we all have the same real strong commitment to building a better world, particularly for our children and their children, and that is so critical, particularly at the moment.
And closely linked to that, something else that the Pope has spoken about a lot is that when it comes to refugees, recognizing that refugees are human beings with their own stories, their own experiences, their own gifts, and stories that begin long before they arrive in the country where they're seeking sanctuary, whether that's a neighbouring country, whether it's Europe, whether it's here in the UK. From CAFOD's experience, could you tell us about some of those stories, some of the main factors that are driving people from their homes today?
Indeed. And Liam, you're absolutely right that some of the scale of the challenge is pretty enormous. I think the UNHCR's latest report said that in 2020, the numbers of people fleeing wars, violence, persecution, and human rights violations rose to over 82 million people. 82 million people kind of on the move, and they're people who have, and they're sort of people who have left their country. We forget that there's a very significant number of people who are what are called internally displaced. So people have to move out of where they live, but they're still within the borders of their countries. So in terms of the main factors, well, the biggest one is war and violence and conflict, and that is by far the biggest drivers of forced displacement, both within countries and of course between countries. And what's interesting is more than 2/3 of all people who fled abroad come from just 5 countries, and they're all experiencing war or other kinds of deep political instability and violence. So Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, Venezuela is considerable. So, I mean, I guess what's on people's, there's all sorts of examples that I could give you from all sorts of different countries, but I guess what's in people's minds very much at the moment would be things like a place like Afghanistan. And CAFOD is supporting local organizations and local partners in terms of, well, what are the best ways that we can support and assist people in terms of facing the crises that they're facing in their individual countries. So in Afghanistan, we've got challenges about, well, there are people who need to flee now, literally, need to reach a place of safety. And then there are longer term questions about, and then there's also issues about delivering humanitarian assistance to people in immediate need, and then longer term support, particularly from an Afghan perspective around women's rights activists and long term economic development. And so that's reflected in CAFOD's work in terms of being able to have an emergency response. We do a lot of work in responding to emergencies, many of which never get onto the headlines or the newspapers, let alone a disasters emergency committee appeal, but we're out there delivering support to local agencies all the time. And then, of course, there are long-term development programs, many of which are about effective farming and food production technique, a lot around economic development, and also helping to build resilience of communities. So things like early warning systems for natural disasters and other better ways of kind of farming or land natural resource management. There's a whole raft of stuff that CAFOD does. So that war and violence is a major factor, and I think it's really important that the role of the church in not just providing sanctuary but also speaking out and trying to be peace builders is really critical. And I know how your own experience of working with bishops' conferences around the world has been so important to that. Another really important aspect in terms of forcing migration and movement of people is the environment and the impacts of climate change. And very, very particularly, and perhaps the sort of tip of the iceberg, is that increase in frequency of sudden natural disasters. So things like, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013. It was 4 million people were displaced by that, and there's real issues there. But underneath that, we've got what are called kind of like slow build kind of crises, things like rising sea levels, which happen gradually, but actually can displace people very significantly. And then other issues like, for instance, we're talking quite a bit at the moment because we're thinking about the climate negotiations, and we're talking about kind of warming temperatures, and it's as if it's not like it's a sunny day. It's about that systematic kind of warming. Every degree of warming, of temperature rises, has a massive impact on our ability to produce food. It can impact our cereal crops by 5%. So it can have really significant impacts on the way in which people can produce food, the kind of crops that can be produced. And obviously, CAFOD is working with people to have the right kind of climate resilient crops and to grow different types of crops that can still enable them to feed themselves and their families and communities, but in a more sustainable way. So I think there is issues about war and conflict. There's issues about environmental crises. Linked also to environmental crises are things like environmental projects. A lot of people, about 15 million people around the world, are displaced by projects that are specifically kind of harmful to the environment. Things like dams or the movement, the land grabs and deforestation that move indigenous peoples, particularly like that. So that kind of forced expropriation of people is incredibly significant, not just because of the way in which it's done, but it's also, particularly for indigenous people, breaks down their spiritual and kind of the bonds of their identity, if you like. And we know Pope Francis has had very particular concern for the Amazon and Congo basins as a particular example. So the other side of the issue for that as well, for me, is obviously issues of climate change are things that we're talking about quite a lot. So we need to understand that those tentacles kind of move out quite a way. But it's not just those environmental defenders that often face death threats, but other human rights defenders and people who face real threats because of things like their sexuality even. So there are those other kind of factors, more perhaps social factors, that also kind of impact on people's sense of security and fear that means they have no option other than to flee.
That really reflects a lot of what we've heard throughout this video series. That one of the other speakers was talking to us about how we often talk in this country about the years of peace since the Second World War, but actually, while that might be the case for the UK, there's many of those countries you talked about that haven't experienced peace at all. And likewise with the environmental disasters that are taking place, while here we're probably seeing more limited impacts of the climate emergency. As you say, right now, tens of millions of people are being displaced around the world because of war, because of climate change and others. And does that not just underscore what Pope Francis is talking about, looking beyond our own borders and understanding how these things affect our whole human family, not just us here?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that the scale of those kind of levels of disruption, we haven't even begun to kind of realize what we're talking about. I think the International Organization for Migration says that or they estimate that between 25 million and 1 billion people will be displaced by environmental disruption between now and 2050. And, so that's a very, very big range of numbers. 25 million to 1 billion, is a lot of people. And I think that again, I see a lot of the narrative, certainly from politicians in this country, which is about being divisive. It's about creating an us and them. And at the same time, I see how churches and church communities are, praying and acting and responding with love and compassion. And it feels like it's completely in dissonance. And I find myself feeling very, very angry at the way in which the political narrative is being used to divide us, when in fact we are all part of one human family. And it's totally immoral, I believe, to be using that kind of approach and that language to to divide people and to justify, frankly, inhumane policies.
I think you've touched there on a lot of what Pope Francis is calling us to do as Catholics in terms of responding to that, changing the narrative. And we've heard throughout this series as well about a lot of the practical things people can do to welcome refugees here, and also heard from you today about that incredible work that CAFOD's doing around the world, that the Catholic community here is supporting and has the opportunities to support. So just to finish off, when it comes to a lot of these structural justice issues, things like war, poverty, the climate emergency, what more can we as individual Catholics realistically do about those?
Well, the first answer is really easy, and it's I don't mean it to sound trite in any way, shape, or form, but prayer is important. You know, for us, it's a really critical element, and the fact that we pray in our mass, in our communities on a regular basis for peace in the world is so important. So let's never forget that, and prayer opens our hearts, I think, to others. And I think you're absolutely right that the opportunities for us around, that's one of the reasons why CAFOD does, campaign and does advocacy work and tries to influence the British government and other institutions as well. It is really important. When I'm in a meeting with a minister, it's not just me. He or she will look at me and they will see, yes, it's me, but they'll see the Catholic community from England and Wales, and that's who I represent. It's that voice of not just me, but the millions of people, both here and around the world, who are serious and active. And because the church, both as an institution and as a community, is putting its money where its mouth is speaking out and is doing the kind of support and response to need that is so necessary, that gives me a huge amount of credibility. It's not just CAFOD doing great work, it's because the church as a whole is doing great work. But CAFOD's longer term campaigning work seek to address the structural issues that are causing poverty, conflict and injustice, and ways in which the British government and other powerful countries and other powerful forces are continuing to either drive climate change or broken food systems or unjust wars. That's what we continue to campaign on. So please do continue to support CAFOD and donate and organise fundraisers. But there's lots going on. We're part of a community and we're part of a world. And I think other Caritas agencies, people like Jesuit Refugee Services, others that are really getting involved are so critical. And I think that's the one thing I say to people is, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's so much going on. Find out what's going on and get involved in it and support it. Whether it's big or small, every little helps, as they say.
Christine, thank you so much for talking to us today about this, and thank you for giving that global perspective, bringing the voices of the people who CAFOD work with, and giving us those practical examples of how we can respond to Pope Francis' call, which I think, in the midst of all the difficulties we're seeing, all the factors that are driving people from their homes around the world, give a real cause for hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Liam.